Wonderful. Thanks, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Almirall to our InCHIP lecture series. Dr. Almirall is a research associate professor with tenure at the University of Michigan, and he's co-director of the Data Science for Dynamic Intervention Decision-Making Lab. Dr. Almirall is a statistician who develops methodologies to form evidence-based adaptive interventions. Adaptive interventions are used to guide individualized intervention decisions for the ongoing management of chronic illnesses or disorders. Recently, Dr. Almirall has been developing methods to inform the construction of optimized multi-level adaptive implementation interventions, or MAISYs, which he'll be speaking with us about today. Dr. Almirall has over 85 publications and book chapters. He's currently PI on a P50 award and an R01 from the NIH, and also PI on a 3-year grant from the Institute of Educational Sciences. He's also co-investigator on 3 active R01s. Dr. Almirall's work on adaptive interventions has been groundbreaking. It has helped to shape how we conduct clinical research in the behavioral and social sciences, and we feel absolutely honored to have him here today. Dr. Almirall will start his talk in a moment, but please do hold questions until the end. And with no further delay, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Danny Almirall. Thanks for being with us today, Danny.
Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks, Trisha. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, I want to thank Trisha, Melanie, and Josh for this opportunity and for working with me over the last couple days to put this on, okay? It sounds like in this particular venue, we don't do questions throughout, so I'm just gonna jump right in and give a talk. This is a little hard for me because I can't read your faces and I can't hear you, and I prefer that, but this is life in the virtual realm. So I'm gonna be giving a talk on this new topic, and when I say new, I mean I've been working on it maybe for 6 months. It was part of the talk I gave at CIRC. It's on multi-level adaptive implementation strategies. And because today's talk is only 40 minutes, I'm actually going to skip the first third of my talk, and I'm going to assume the majority of my audience understands what implementation science is. But instead of skipping the entire third altogether, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to show one slide from the first third, just to bring us all to the same page, and then I'm going to jump right here on slide 18. Nonetheless, you guys will all have access to these slides. I'm happy to share them, and if you don't get them from Trisha and Melanie, you can get them from me by emailing me, and I'll have a link to my website and email at the end, okay? All right, well, let me get going with my first slide, which will be slide number 7. And this is really just a review for those of you that are new to implementation science or have never heard of it. In this area of science, we develop these things we call implementation strategies. From my point of view as a methodologist, it's got a fancy name, implementation strategy, but it's nothing more than an intervention. It's just a special type of intervention. And the whole goal is it's an intervention designed to get an evidence-based practice into place in some sort of practice setting, whether that be a health system, a clinic, a school, but it really is just an intervention. That's all it is. And so this is a quick review of what an implementation strategy is. It's got all these components. First of all, there's an implementer, and that's my little guy right here in the top left, okay? And as with all interventions, interventions are not received, interventions are offered or provided. And that's why you see the implementer pushing an action, okay? And that's the fourth bullet here. The action here is the actual strategy itself. For example, facilitation or coaching or whatever the intervention is, or whatever the multifaceted multi-component intervention is that is being used to get, for example, a clinic or a school to adopt an evidence-based practice. There's always a bunch of different levels in this setting because you're working in schools, which are nested within districts, or you're working in clinics, which are nested within health systems, or you're working with practitioners, which are nested within clinics, and so on and so forth. So we have the implementer, we have the levels, and then there's always a target A target is which one of those levels am I targeting and which one of the people within the levels am I targeting? So are you targeting the practitioners, the prescribers within a clinic? The action I already discussed. And then there's two more down here, which are nothing, they're not really part of the actual strategy themselves, but when we write down the strategy, we think of them because we always expect that our action, that is our coaching or facilitation, whatever the case may be, has short-term effects and long-term effects, okay? And then, of course, what I'm not showing here, way off on the far right, are changes in health and education outcomes, okay? So everything I'm going to be talking about today is going to remain within the realm of implementation. So when I think about proximal and distal outcomes, I'm talking about implementation outcomes, such as number of CBT sessions delivered at the school, quality of the CBT delivered at the school, and so on, okay? Okay, that was my first third of my talk. All right, and now I'm gonna jump over to slide 18, and this is only because I only have 40 minutes instead of an hour. Okay, so here we go. All right, what I'm talking about today is an idea, a concept, a type of implementation strategy called a MAISY, a multi-level adaptive implementation strategy. And what I want all of us to do on this call right now is I'd like all of us to take off our researcher hats, okay? So for about half of this talk, we are not going to be researchers. And I'm doing that because I want to impress upon you and I want you to understand that the first half of this talk has nothing to do with research. This thing I'm calling a MAISY is a thing that lives out in the wild. It's done by an implementer, not a researcher, and it is the thing the implementer is doing to try to improve the adoption of an evidence-based practice and in some sort of clinic system, health system, or school. Okay, so what is a MAISY? A MAISY is a sequence of decision rules used to guide how best to adapt the provision of specific implementation strategies. And it does this at critical decision points, across multiple levels, that's why the word multi-level is there, and perhaps most interestingly, based on baseline and ongoing changing status of the targets within the organization. Okay, and I'm going to flesh this out for you. I think the best way is to show you this really cool graphic that Ian Burnett helped me put together, or Ian Burnett actually put together for us. All right, and so earlier I introduced just a regular vanilla standard implementation strategy. Here I'm showing you a MAISY. It's got a few other moving parts, which I want to talk to you about, okay? And you can see these other moving parts are mostly down here in the bottom, okay? All right, so how exactly is this any different from what you saw earlier on slide 7? I've underlined over here on the left the different components, okay? And let me tell you what they are. I'm going to start right here at AT, my action, okay? In my fourth bullet, I have decision points. And the reason for this is because a multi-level adaptive implementation strategy takes place at separate decision points over the course of implementation. And that's what my little T denotes. And I call those decision points, okay? And we didn't have that in our vanilla standard implementation strategy. We only have that now because we're going to be talking about things that are happening at each of these decision points. Okay, that's my T. At each of these decision points, I have action options. And you see how the word option is underlined there. The reason the word option is underlined there is because at every single one of these decision points, okay, and this is a decision point from the perspective of an implementer. Let's be clear about that. At each one of these decision points, the implementer has to decide what action option to provide. So maybe at the first decision point, they're providing facilitation. Maybe at a second decision point, they're providing something else. But at every decision point, I have a set of options. That entire set of options is part of what we're talking about here. That action is taken at that decision point, and then we come to the proximal outcomes. In slide 7, in the old days, in a standard implementation strategy, this was in some ways the end of it, right? You got your proximal outcome and then you just wait and see. In this world, things are a little bit different. Some of those proximal outcomes are going to be used to make a decision about the next action at the next decision point. And then we go in a circle. So for example, I take an action, I see what happens in the short run, I use that information or some of that information to craft a tailoring variable. Actually, it's already been crafted. It's already been decided for you ahead of time. It's a particular tailoring variable. And then I'm going to use that tailoring variable to decide, here's my decision rule, what I'm going to do next, what the next action is. So these are two new concepts here, a decision rule, that's why it's underlined, and a tailoring variable or a set of tailoring variables. And these tailoring variables are inputs into my decision rule, and the output of that decision rule is the action, okay? And it goes on and on and on for a pre-specified number of decision points. This is a MAISY in a theoretical sense, in the sense of defining what it is and what the components are. Okay, I'd like to give you an example because that is how all of us learn the best, is with examples. So let me give you an example of a MAISY that takes place in high schools across the state of Michigan. So here where I live, every high school in the state of Michigan already has embedded within it anywhere between 1 and 4 school professionals that deliver mental health and substance use services to the students. Okay, that's already in place in the state of Michigan. And these school professionals, they run the gamut. They could be social workers, school psychologists, and so on and so forth. They might have masters, they might have PhDs, they might have bachelors. It really runs the gamut. And in this particular MAISY that I'm about to discuss, the goal of the MAISY, the intended distal outcome, is to get cognitive behavioral therapy adopted, implemented, and sustained inside of these high schools. And the reason for that is because I don't know how it is in Connecticut, but in the state of Michigan, for the most part, the practices that are being used to impact mental health and substance use in high schools across Michigan are not evidence-based. So this is an implementation strategy trying to change that. Now, what am I not showing you here? What I'm not showing you here is who the implementer is. For now, I want you to pretend all of you are the implementer. And if that doesn't feel comfortable, then, because remember, I took your research hats off. Remember that? Or if that doesn't feel comfortable, I want you to imagine the state of Michigan Department of Education is the implementer. So they're going out to the schools, they're going out to their districts, their counties, and they're rolling this out. Okay, so what is it? Well, in this particular example, there's a first thing that the state of Michigan does. It has a district level component called REP, Replicating Effectiveness Programs. And what the district and what the state of Michigan does here is at each one of these districts, they host a big training day where they invite all of the school professionals at all the high schools in that district, and they have a training on cognitive behavioral therapy. It's one day or 1 day and a half, and the training is supposed to sort of be the initiation of this entire strategy that the state is putting on. And what they're going to do is they're going to train all the staff, all the school professionals. They're going to deliver the CBT manual to each school professional. They're going to give them some pointers. They're going to tell them why we're doing this, the importance of doing this. And they're also, toward the end of the day, going to give a phone number and an email to a brick and mortar site, not at the district, it happens to be in Ann Arbor, where any of the school professionals or any of the professionals at any of the high schools can call in and troubleshoot any challenges they're having as they attempt to deliver CBT in their schools. Okay? And then there's a few other bells and whistles like a newsletter that gets pushed out once monthly just to keep the school professionals engaged. Okay, everybody with me? So this is considered a low intensity intervention because it really only takes place on 1 day, and it has a newsletter, and it requires the school to reach out for help. So it's considered a low intensity intervention. Okay, that's REP. 12 weeks into the program, which coincides with, 12 weeks into the program, what's going to happen is the implementer, the state of Michigan, is going to take a look to see which schools hit the ground running and, or which schools have, they're going to think about and they're going to be asking and they're going to decide which are the startup schools and which are not the startup schools. So a startup school is a school, and it's defined down here, with school professionals who do not have any training in CBT or have never provided CBT to any of their students. And the non-startup schools is the complement of that. And if you have a school that's a startup school, that school is now going to receive a new implementation strategy called coaching. Okay, notice that now this strategy is at the school level. It's in purple. And the reason it's at the school level is because not all schools are going to get this. Notice, only the startup schools got coaching. Coaching is pretty expensive. In fact, the way it was operationalized in this MAISY, we had an implementer or a coach drive out to every school, actually drove out and would sit with them every single week. And when I say them, I mean the school professionals within the school, coach them on how to do CBT, watch them do it in vivo, and then give feedback. And the coaches were coaching all sorts of versions of CBT, a group-based CBT, an individual-based CBT, and a very light version, sort of brief individual CBT. So there were various types of CBT that the coach was trying to teach these school professionals to deliver in their everyday work. Then at week 21, remember, the implementer's monitoring these schools. And at week 21, we happen to know something about whether a school is an early responder or a suboptimal or slow responding school. And down here at the bottom, I've defined what that means. A slow responding school is a school in which any one of the following two things happen. Either any of the SPs, school professionals, report not providing 3 or more components of CBT to greater than 10 students. And that's a very low bar. Like, if you're not doing that as a school professional, you're really not doing much. And we know that from prior literature. We knew where to put these cutoffs in terms of, we know that the demand for CBT is much higher than this. So this is considered a low bar. So either you trigger that, okay, or, notice the or on average for that school, the SPs report more than 2 barriers to CBT delivery. And the way we're getting this information is these schools are being monitored over the course of those 21 weeks. That's how we know whether you're a startup school, and that's how we know if you end up being a responding school or slow responding school at week 21. And I want to make something really clear in this example. When we say responding and slow responding school, that is not a permanent label for the school. That is a temporary label used to make the decision of what to do next. So what are we doing next? Well, what we're doing next as part of this MAISY is if you are a responding school, we're using the if it ain't broke, don't fix it strategy. You continue coaching. However, if you are a slow responding school, that is, if you triggered either or of these two definitions, you now get augmented, the entire school that is, gets augmented with facilitation. Now, whereas coaching is a CBT skills implementation strategy, facilitation is a whole different beast. I consider it a businessy implementation strategy in the sense that facilitation really tries to help the school professionals and anyone at the school overcome any barriers that are being encountered by the school professionals to delivering CBT or to delivering high quality CBT. Believe it or not, and I didn't know this before this MAISY was rolled out, in high schools in Michigan, sometimes school professionals can't even find a room to deliver CBT. It's mind-boggling, but it is true, okay? And so notice that this facilitation is very different from the facilitation that was low intensity that was provided on day 1 where they got the phone number. In that facilitation, we expect the school and the school professionals to reach out to the facilitator. But over here, this is much more expensive and much more intense. In this facilitation, the school professionals in schools are getting regular phone calls by the facilitator. So this is sort of upping the ante and upping the intensity of an implementation strategy. And this went on till week 44, and that concluded the delivery of this MAISY. Everything I've just talked to you today is a MAISY. Nothing I've just talked about to you so far has anything to do with research. I want you guys to understand that. There's no research going on here. I wanted to give you a second example, and this one I'm going to fly through it a little faster. This one's actually taking place in Connecticut by a colleague of mine at Yale called Elizabeth Connors. And her goal is to get measurement-based care implemented in schools across Connecticut. And she has a MAISY, but it's a little bit different. She's got a district level intervention that's pretty involved. It's pretty involved. And she doesn't actually go out to the schools. She brings everybody together, everyone who works at the schools, because in Connecticut, things are a little bit different. The mental health services are delivered by these district level people who are hired at the district level, and they kind of go out to multiple schools sometimes to deliver it. So she's got a district level intervention, which she calls Focus, and that's shown in green here. It's got all sorts of different layers. The key thing I want to draw your attention to is that 4 months into her program, she knows whether a clinician inside of any one of these districts, that's the purple, is under implementing, and this is how she defines it. The clinician collected one or more outcome measures on less than 40% of the students served in the first 4 months, and if that is true, then you are under implementing. And if you're under implementing, then she provides this pretty expensive intervention. It's an extra strategy because it's expensive because it's at the individual level, and there's a lot of these folks in Connecticut. Where she provides individual consultation to try to understand and help the clinicians deliver measurement-based care as part of the mental health services they're delivering. Okay, this also is amazing because it has multiple levels and it has a time factor. Okay, why are MAISYs, now that you know what MAISYs are, why are they important? The speed of adoption option varies across the targets in my organization. Not all targets are ready to take on more. Sometimes I want to use a MAISY because I want to strategically sequence certain strategies. For example, I may want to lay a strong foundation for other strategies I know I'm going to use later or I might use later, depending if they're triggered. MAISYs are also consistent with vertical health equity principles in the sense that you are providing the implementation strategy at the right time and for the right organization that needs it the most, right? So that's pretty consistent. I'm saving my resources for the sites that need it the most rather than expending my resources equally across all my organizations. That would be equality. Engagement is often critical in implementation. So in the short run, it's not just about fidelity. Sometimes in the short run, you got to get the implementer has to engage the school professionals in the schools to do the work of adopting CBT, and that could be quite challenging. You might have schools that don't engage in the short run, and you want to adapt to that. And so that would be a rationale for a MAISY. So MAISYs are not just about rolling out different implementation strategies. They're also about rolling out different implementation engagement strategies. This often, I got to say, this issue of engagement, I would say 80% of the time gets swept under the rug in our field, and it's pretty unfortunate. But that is one reason you might do a MAISY. All of us know that more is not better. This is almost always true across basically any behavioral intervention I've ever studied or thought about. There's usually a U-shaped curve where the more you give, everything starts to backfire, and that's because the more you give, the more burden the more you're expecting of the folks and the targets you're intervening on, and then they're just not doing their work, or you end up with burnout or other things like that. So more is not always better. That's a reason to do a MAISY. And then of course there's resource and cost efficiency because, for example, you might step up with more intense strategies for the sites that need it, or you might think of efficiency in a different way. You might expend a lot of money and resources up front and then think about the MAISY in the opposite direction. You might step down the strategy for the targets that are doing well. Okay, let me take a drink. MAISYs are guides for implementers. I said it earlier. This is for implementation practitioners, community service providers, policymakers, clinical leaders. It is not for researchers. A MAISY is not a research method. Remember, all of you have taken off your research hats until I tell you. A MAISY is not an experimental design. A MAISY is not an adaptive trial design. It's not an approach to data analysis, and it is not an approach to conducting a pilot study. A MAISY is a real deal implementation strategy that someplace like the state of Michigan or Kaiser Permanente or whatever other health system could use to get evidence-based practices implemented, adopted, and sustained. A few other things I wanted to share. MAISYs are all pre-specified and pre-planned, just like any good intervention. What's pretty cool about MAISYs, I'm finding, is that a lot of the researchers, even though you have your researcher's hat off right now, they really like MAISYs because the mechanisms that you expect are at work can be used as part of the MAISY as a tailoring variable. People really love that. They love to sort of intervene on a system, see what happens in the short run, and then grab that thing and make the next decision. Notice that is not mechanism in the sense of research. That's mechanism in the sense of intervening, in the sense of implementation. I am not going to have time to talk about the fourth bullet, but it is a word of caution, and if you want to email me about it, I want to caution against conflating everything I've just talked about with this idea in our world, which is called adaptation. Adaptation is something slightly different the way it's being used in implementation right now, and that is not what a MAISY is, possibly not what a MAISY is, okay? There's a little bit of confusion about what's meant by adaptation, especially in terms of whether it's being done by a researcher or by an implementer. I'm trying to be very clear in this talk that everything I've talked about so far is something an implementer does, not something a researcher does. Okay, I have about 17 minutes left in my talk. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm moving into the final third of my talk. And now I am going to talk about developing an optimized MAISY. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to be talking about these things I'm calling optimization questions. And they're actually optimization scientific questions. I'm going to show you 13 of them. And at this point in time, I want all of you to put your researcher hats back on, okay? And that makes perfect sense, right? That makes perfect sense because the last third of this talk is about us researchers trying to come up with a really good MAISY. And how do we do our work? What's our currency? What's our bread and butter? Well, we like to ask questions. That's what we do as researchers, okay? So let's ask some questions. I'm going to show you 13 of them. And these are 13 questions you might ask as a researcher, and you might want to know the answer for as you undergo the process of developing a really high quality MAISY. Are we all on the same page? I can't see your faces, and you're not allowed to interrupt me, but at this point, I'm hoping everyone is nodding their heads and understanding how we are about to shift gears here. Okay, so this is the real fun now, because now we're talking science. So you guys as researchers have a bunch of questions. Here are 4 very basic but very important ones. You might say, Danny, in the context of that ASIC example that you gave, what's the effectiveness of coaching? It's so expensive. Do we really need it? Or you might say, what's the effectiveness of facilitation? Do I really need to make those phone calls once a month or once a week to the schools, among the schools that are slow responding? You might also be interested in the interaction between early and later stage strategies. So does coaching in stage 1 interact synergistically with facilitation in stage 2 for the sites that need it to produce beneficial outcomes? In other words, this is like your interaction term. Does 1 + 1 = 3, right? Or does 1 + 1 just equal 2? Or worst case scenario, when I do coaching and facilitation, does it backfire? And you might as well have just done coaching or have just done facilitation. Well, these are questions we like to ask as scientists, right? Another question you might have is, Danny, do I really need this to be adaptive? You might say, Danny, maybe what's the effect of the MAISY shown earlier versus only coaching? Maybe we don't need to monitor for suboptimally responding schools. Maybe we just walk through the door and we give all the schools coaching, and we never think about anything else. Okay? Well, when you're trying to answer questions like this, you are neither doing pilot studies nor confirmatory evaluation studies. You are doing what I call an optimization study, which is very different from the way all of you were trained. This idea of optimization is pretty new. When I say new, I mean, last 10, 15 years. So for most of us that were trained eons ago, we did not know this when we got our PhDs and our masters. So this study that I'm showing you here is a SMART. A SMART is neither a piloting study nor an evaluation study. A SMART is a type of optimization trial. And the whole purpose of a SMART is to answer questions that are optimization questions, because you want to assemble a really good MAISY. So in this case, I'm showing you something called a clustered SMART. The reason it's clustered is because I have 100 schools, and all of them are getting randomized at week 12 to whether or not they get coaching. Notice the schools are getting randomized. Well, of course they are, because coaching is a school level intervention. You wouldn't put it anywhere else. You wouldn't randomize a school professional to coaching unless you're willing to provide only school professionals coaching to some and not to others. Coaching here is a school level intervention. So the little r with a little s denotes a school level randomization. And that's because I really want to know what's the effect of coaching. In fact, all of these questions I showed you here, these first basic but important ones, are all about to be answered in this study I'm showing you right here. Then at week 21, among the schools that are slow responding, notice what I just said, only among the schools that are slow responding, I randomized to whether or not those schools get facilitation or not. That's because I really want to know, among these schools right here that are slow responding, do we need facilitation? I'm trying to answer that second question. Now, notice we already know from this, before we ever did this study, we already had decided that schools that are responding ought not ever even be considered for facilitation. That was already decided. That was an aspect of the MAISY that was already decided. Here we're asking a different question. Among the schools that are not doing so hot, do we need facilitation? And I'm sorry about the note at the bottom. That's a typo from a previous talk, but I'm showing you a sneak peek at the surprising results that we found. And I need to orient you to this slide. I need to orient you so that you understand it. First, on the y-axis is our primary outcome, which is the total amount of CBT delivered in that phase of the MAISY. Okay, and the MAISY basically had these two phases right here, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 3 was well after the MAISY was all done with. So at the end of phase 2B, there is no more MAISY. So you can think of this last phase, phase 3, as the follow-up research phase. Okay? And on the left, any dot with a circle, okay, any dot with a circle, if you look at circle blue, that's just rep. So imagine if all I ever did was give you only rep. So I want you to notice something in this study. Some of these schools only ever got rep. Take a look. You see how all the schools here were randomized? Well, the schools that didn't get coaching, they're just getting rep. And you see how over here, only the slow responding schools, some of them didn't get facilitation, which means if some of these schools didn't get facilitation and didn't get coaching, then those are the schools that only ever got rep. Well, that is what's being shown in this top left color in a circle, which is blue. Notice that that is not an adaptive strategy. So this little blue line you see here in circle, it is not an adaptive strategy. It's not adaptive at all. All the schools just get rep. Similarly, in this study, there were also some schools that only got coaching all the way throughout. So here we got, if you get randomized to coaching, and if you were a slow responding school that didn't get coaching, that didn't get facilitation, then you were a school that, again, you got coaching throughout with no adaptation. So in this picture, anything with a circle, these two guys on the left, they're actually not adaptive implementation strategies. It's only the two strategies on the right the triangled ones, the ones that involve the facilitation component, that are adaptive, because recall, facilitation was only provided to schools that were suboptimally responding. Okay, on this plot, high is good. This was our primary outcome. We wanted to see higher CBT delivery. Of course, we have a bunch of other outcomes I'm not showing you here, like the quality of the CBT, but our primary outcome was to get the schools to adopt CBT. Notice the surprising results. The best intervention, the best strategy in the study was actually the MAISY that did not provide coaching, but did provide facilitation to the schools who needed it the most. So in this study, we're seeing the issue of more is not always better rear its head. And this is pretty fascinating. This is not what we conjectured. We conjectured that the bottom right here, this triangle green, we thought that would be the best one because, that's our kitchen sink MAISY. That's the one that's using all the money and all the resources. That's the one where we do coaching. And if you're not doing so hot, we do facilitation. Well, it didn't work out the way we thought it would. It turns out, on average, the best strategy is the one that provides coaching and then brings in facilitation for the struggling sites. And I think that's pretty fascinating. And you can kind of see the really powerful role of facilitation here. If you think about it, you can kind of see this huge jump right here, right in this phase here, which is sustained in the follow-up period, but not really sustained so much, when coaching was provided. It's almost like the drawbacks of coaching, which happened early on, could never catch back up, even when we provided facilitation. That's almost what's happening here. Okay, I have 7 more minutes left, 7-ish, maybe I'll go 10. And I'm gonna walk you through all the other questions just to get you excited. I could have just given a talk on this and given you all the results, but as a methodologist, I wanna show you what's possible, right? That's what I do as a statistician. I wanna show you what's possible. So there's a bunch of other questions we can ask. So one of them is there a better way to define non-response? So remember how we had those cutoffs for what it meant to be a slow responding school? Well, should we move the cutoff a little bit? Should we use a more lenient definition? That is an even lower cutoff for what it means to be a responding school? Of course, if we do that, then that means we provide even less facilitation. So maybe that's not a good idea, but we could have a question about that, right? Other questions and all of these questions are all about tailoring, right? A lot of scientists have questions about tailoring. So one of the questions about tailoring is, wait a minute, Danny, in all 4 of these adaptive implementation strategies, these MAISYs, in none of them you tailored the decision to coach. That's correct, we didn't. But perhaps only startup schools require coaching. Do you all remember that first MAISY I showed you, that example I showed you at the beginning of the talk when you guys weren't researchers, and I tailored the decision to provide coaching only for startup schools? Well, is that a good idea? Can we provide some evidence behind that decision to only provide coaching to startup schools? That's a cool question, and it's about a baseline tailoring variable. But there's even cooler questions, which is, among the schools that are suboptimally responding, these right here, remember, suboptimal response is not a permanent label. Those schools are all very different. It could be I have some suboptimally responding schools right at the edge of the cutoff and others that are very badly suboptimally responding. Well, do all of them need facilitation, or is there some heterogeneity among these schools, and can I really pick out the ones that really, really need it? That's similar to this question of where do you put the cutoff? But here, I'm thinking about it more in terms of like, are there other variables I should be monitoring that would inform that decision? Isn't that cool? So you could ask all sorts of these questions. Here's a couple more about tailoring. Can we discover, or do we have evidence for, a multi-level tailoring variable? That's so fascinating, because at any one of these decisions, remember, this is a MAISY, right? At any one of these decisions, the decision to provide coaching, maybe it's not just about what's happening at the school, it might be about what's happening at the district, right? That is fascinating. So that would be a higher level tailoring variable. And For example, should facilitation be offered only to optimally responding schools within the lowest resource school districts? That would be a phenomenal question for the state of Michigan to know the answer to, right? They would be thrilled to know that, because then they can marshal their resources only for facilitation, only to the low resource schools, right? You guys love this question 9. You guys love it because you guys love mechanisms, and I'm a fan of them too. I have no problem with mechanisms. Is the putative mechanism useful in making decisions? The reason I love this kind of question is oftentimes we talk about mechanisms and how amazing they are, but rarely do we use mechanisms in a way that is more than just telling the story of how something worked or how something didn't work. Here in MAISYs, we get to use mechanisms and ask the following question: is my mechanism useful in helping me make the next strategy decision? So for example, is facilitation necessary in suboptimally responding schools delivering higher quality CBT as a result of coaching? So notice, coaching is supposed to improve CBT skills. If the school is providing really high quality CBT, do I really need facilitation? Maybe not, right? Okay, at this point in my talk, I have a few minutes left. I would sort of pause, take a drink of water, and look at your faces and make sure everybody's caught up with me. I can't do that because now I'm shifting gears to something super nuanced. So if you've been falling asleep, I want you to wake up because it's not only nuanced, but it's delicious in terms of our science. And these are some real novel questions you can ask. So are there sleeper effects of prior strategies? This is fascinating because oftentimes in a MAISY, it could happen that a strategy I provide earlier doesn't really turn on, so to speak, in the short run, but maybe it turns on later when followed by a second strategy. It has kind of a sleeper effect. Oh, that's delicious. Or how about this one? Maybe a strategy I used earlier, like coaching, has a prescriptive effect. In other words, maybe I went into the school, I did this coaching, I actually drove out there, and now the coach knows something about the school, very special, that no one else knows, right? Because in the schools that didn't get coaching, there is no coach to know this, right? And maybe that information the coach knows can be useful in making a decision later. That's sort of like a power of information, a power of knowledge question. It's so delicious, right? And this can totally happen, right? In other words, one of the benefits of coaching above and beyond or regardless of CBT skills might be that I sent someone out there and they, in the process of coaching, learn something that is going to help me tailor in the future. How delicious is that? Okay? And I'm going to kind of skip over this because we're coming up to the 1:15 mark here. But I'm going to just I'm going to skip the focused example, which takes place in your great state of Connecticut. And I hope that's okay. But I'm going to just jump to these other questions, which are fascinating, okay? The last 2 questions, okay? It turns out that, well, I have to say something about the Connecticut study. So in the Connecticut study, one of the things we are asking is, how do we define an implementing or an under-implementing clinician? So notice here, all the clinicians get re-randomized. In fact, in this study, there's only one randomization. This is not a SMART. And we're trying to decide, how should we decide what an under-implementing clinician is? That's actually Elizabeth's question, so that she can provide individual consultation only to them. But take a look at this. Look how cool this is. You ready? One of her questions could be, is there an optimal tipping point effect? In other words, over here, a decision has to be made by the state of Connecticut or the district in terms of like, how many of those consultants should get individual consultation? So let's fast forward to a world where we already know how to define under-implementing clinician. Well, I have a limited budget in the state of Connecticut. Is there an optimal tipping point? Should we only provide individual consultation up to 30% of under-implementers or up to 70%? That's pretty cool because I can actually do that in a SMART. I can actually answer that question, which is so nuanced and so delicious, in a SMART. But I have to do it using multiple levels of randomization. My first randomization is a decision by the district to either penetrate only 30% of the clinicians in a district or penetrate 70%. So think about it, so this is really important to a state like Connecticut, right? Am I only going to provide individual consultation, which is extremely expensive, to only 70% of the clinicians in need or only 30% of the clinicians in need? That's fascinating, because it could be that I might be able to get away with 30% if there is something called a spillover effect, right? Isn't that fascinating? Like, it could be that only intervening on 30% of the very most difficult, challenging, the clinicians with the most difficult, challenging cases, maybe that has a spillover effect to all of the other under-implementing clinicians. That is fascinating. No such question has ever been asked, as far as I know, in implementation science. And for me as a statistician, what's fascinating here is it would require 2 levels of randomization. And of course, for me, that's beautiful, because I then have to go come up with new ways to analyze the data, right? That's the reason I get grants, is to come up with all these methods I'm talking to you about. And how do we collect the data? How do we analyze it? How do we explain to people what the possibilities are? That's sort of my bread and butter. Okay, final slide. And I think I'm right on time. Final slide. So everything I've spoken to you about today is either been all about MAISYs, so it's something that an implementer does, or it's been about research in the optimization space. I have not, and I will not talk today, apart from this slide, about evaluation. Evaluation and optimization are wildly different concepts. Suppose you were a researcher who wanted to do evaluation, and you wanted to evaluate or confirm the effectiveness of this MAISY right here. You would not do the SMARTS I just showed you, or the 2-arm trial, the 2-arm optimization trial Elizabeth Connors is doing at Yale. You wouldn't do anything I just showed you. You would do a standard 2-arm randomized trial. You would take all of your districts in the state of Michigan. Half of them would get this MAISY, and the other half would get either no MAISY or some other suitable control group. This study I'm showing you here is an evaluation study. This study is critically important. This is a study that might come after the studies I just showed you to confirm that your MAISY is effective. Everything I talked about today was optimization, not evaluation. That's a really big idea, and I only showed you 1 slide, but that could be the topic of another hour talk if Trisha wants to invite me back. Okay. These are this is my last slide. Now, unfortunately, our communications and creative lead here at D3C just reminded me that this barcode thing is actually outdated. So if you can do me a favor and just Google D3C, okay, and you'll find my website. I'm sorry about that. Or you can Google my name, which is pretty unique, and you'll find our D3C website. I have all sorts of software, design applets, learning resources, and our center has a P50 from NIDA, and our whole goal for the next 5 years is to turn our website into the one-stop shop on anything having to do with adaptive interventions. And we're kind of already there, but we're going to make it even better for you. And we really want you to come visit our website so you can learn more. Thank you guys for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Danny, thank you. That was fantastic. It's really exciting to hear this next level of adaptive interventions and thinking more about the multi-level interventions and different settings. I also just wanted to say I was perusing your website this morning. It's great. So if anybody is truly interested in this, there are a lot of wonderful resources, and thank you for sharing that with us. So at this point, what we'd like to do is open it up to any questions. So I believe people can now unmute themselves. So you could either speak up or you could enter questions into the chat for Danny.
I'm happy to start. Thank you so much for that talk. That was really informative. I am in the field of survivorship, cancer survivorship, and I'm interested in designing a peer-led intervention for survivors. And I've kind of always been fascinated about this not all survivorship care fits all, this tailored approach to it. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about patients themselves deciding which components of an intervention to receive. So, for example, some people may cope by using religiosity or spirituality, but that would be their choice. Or some people in the survivorship period may want to have some information about diet and exercise, while others may not. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on the patient themselves deciding that kind of optimization or adaptation.
Absolutely. So whenever as interventionists, we think of interventions like the one you just shared with us, and your name is Murad, right?
Maired.
Maired, super fascinating question, because whenever a methodologist thinks about an intervention like the one you just described, the way we conceptualize it and the way we understand it is that is what we call a pool intervention, in the sense that you are expecting, or the way you've designed it is the patient themselves is going to go pool the things they need. Many interventions are like this, many in the world. You could do it through an app, you could do it through a website, you can do it through call me, dear patient, call me when you're in trouble, I'm here for you. You could do it so many different ways. But the thing I want to impress upon you is that intervention is sort of like set it and forget it, in the sense that you do it, you put it out there, and that's it. That's the end of that's the end of you as an interventionist. Now, that doesn't have to be the end. And here's how. It could be that you set it and forget it, and then your actual intervention, the other components of your intervention, are to intervene on the patient to engage with that material. That's a whole different ballgame. So notice the way methodologists like me understand the intervention you just described is if I don't have any engagement components, then it really is a one-time fixed intervention. You put it out in the world, you give them the app, whatever the case may be, and that's it. The actual process of the patient pulling the intervention from the app or the website or whatever the case may be, or giving you a phone call, that's not us intervening. The part that is us intervening, the part that, and so therefore that's not really testable. Like, that's not something we can test in the effectiveness world. It is something we can test in efficacy, but that's not my wheelhouse. So, but what you can test is, I set this intervention out there, I expect that they're going to engage with it, and now you can come in and intervene to get them to engage with the material. Now that, Murray, is fascinating, because now you have all sorts of cool questions as a scientist, because think about it. Suppose you have it on an app. Well, now you got to decide as an intervention, how often do I ping them? When do I call them? And if you do it too much, they're just going to throw the app out the window. And if you do it too little, they're probably not going to engage. So all of a sudden, now you're in my world. Now you're in the world of optimizing the intervention you just described. I'm going to stop there, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question/comment, Danny. So, the whole idea of tailoring variables is very daunting because there's so many, and there's so many possible, solutions and iterations in terms of when we can deliver an intervention, what the cutoffs are for, if somebody's a responder and a non-responder, and what are we expecting for engagement, et cetera, et cetera. As a clinician and as a clinical trials and person who develops intervention, there's just so much to think about. And so I'm just curious, more of just kind of a 23,000 foot perspective, like, what are your thoughts on tailoring variables? Are there things that you think that generally we should focus on first, or just any guidance with tailoring variables, or maybe it's very specific to the particular area and domain. But to me, that seems like I just have a million questions about tailoring variables. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, at the 30,000 foot level, Trisha, thank you for that question. I think you, given the way you prefaced your question, you sound like the kind of scientist that if you were to jump in this world, and if you were to decide to optimize a MAISY, you are going to be asking a lot of these questions I had here on slides 37 and 38. You're going to be asking questions about, or 36 and 37, about tailoring, because you have a lot of questions about that. At the 36,000 foot level, on the airplane, I see a lot of clinician researchers who are like you, but then I see a lot of other clinician researchers and implementation scientists who they kind of know from prior experience, research, or evidence what some of the tailoring variables are. And a perfect example of that is this study here, the ASIC study with Amy. It took me some time to sort of pull it out of Amy and their team. It took like 6 or 9 months to design this study, but after lots of conversation, we realized we already had a tailoring variable, which is schools that are responding ought not receive facilitation. Now, notice how I framed that, Trisha. In some ways, the way I just framed that is I had partial information about tailoring. And the key at the 36,000 foot level, Trisha, the key is any partial information you feel you have or already know, you can embed it in a study like this. Notice, Amy did not know with certainty that slow responding schools need to get facilitation. No, that's why we randomized. What she did know, and it took me a long time to get it out of her, was schools that are responding ought not be considered for facilitation. Notice the subtlety and nuance there, but it's so delicious. And the reason it's so delicious is because I'm trying to impress upon you that any limited information you have, no matter how limited, you can bring it to one of these studies. At the 36,000 foot level, we don't expect all the scientists to have all the questions about tailoring answered. In fact, I want to show you something. One more, Trisha, one more. Take a look at your very own Elizabeth Connors over there at Yale. Take a look. Her study is actually trying to figure out how the heck do I decide who is an under-implementing clinician? She doesn't know. She actually doesn't know. That's why all of the clinicians were randomized. Now, you may not realize that, but I want everybody to look carefully here. She has a tentative definition for under-implementing clinician, and she wrote it in the grant, and she has it in her hand. But regardless of whether that's a good definition, both implementing clinicians and under-implementers, they all get randomized. Notice what's under the hood there, Trisha. What's under the hood there is that she actually wants to test to see if under-implementing clinicians are the ones that should get consultation, and if implementing clinicians, if this effect is near zero. And if she sees that, she now thinks, oh my gosh, now I have evidence for the definition of an under-implementing clinician. I hope that helps you answer your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you. I'm noticing a question in the chat. So Kim writes, can definitely see the application for DNI research. Have you incorporated any of the DNI frameworks like CFIR or PRISM in your work? And if so, can you say a little bit more about that and what you measured / found?
Right. So there are a lot of, we now have, indeed, remember I'm a methodologist, okay? Remember, I now, from my seat as a methodologist and a statistician, I now see an abundance and maybe an overabundance, I don't know, of frameworks in DEI, okay? A ton of them. As far as I'm concerned, if any of those frameworks are useful in helping you craft an optimization question for developing an optimized MAISY, I'm thrilled. In other words, every single scientist I've ever worked with, uses one or more of these frameworks, and all of them use these frameworks to craft their questions. So the short answer there is there's no single framework that's ever been used, and never have I not used the framework. I don't know if that helps you, but everything I shared with you today is sort of bringing together everything we know about implementation science. There's no horse race or anything like that. I hope that helps. MAISYs are agnostic to frameworks. As far as I can tell, frameworks are for the purposes of sort of understanding mechanisms and really trying to generate really good scientific questions. And I think they're all great. I think they're all great.
Well, I realize, Daniel, that we're out of time. I just want to say again, this was fantastic. You did a great job with this presentation, and it's always provocative when I hear you speak. So thank you again. And we might just take you up on your offer to have you teach us a little bit more about this at some point. So
it's great.
Thank you so much. We truly appreciate you coming.
Yeah, thank you guys. And I wanted to share one more thing. On February 2nd at 12:30 Eastern, I'm going to be doing an FAQ webinar on MAISYs. So that's going to be an event that I am just going to sit back and wait for your questions. So I'm going to open it up for an hour or more, and you guys get to ask me things. Okay? All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.